Welcome, everyone. I just want to welcome you guys to the show. I know it's a Saturday morning, but we're dealing with different time zones here, so this is the best time to have our guest in. I really feel what he has to say is super, super important. So I really wanted to get that out there, make sure that this interview happened today. Today we have with us Max Haiven, and he's really going to be speaking to us on the radical imagination. And I'll just let him actually do the rest of the talking, to be honest.
Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Why don't you tell us about yourself and basically who you are and what brought you to write about this?
Sure. Well, my employment right now is as an assistant professor in the Division of Art History and Critical Studies at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. And essentially I teach politics and economics and sociology to artists and art students in the city of Halifax in Canada. But my job doing that and what led me to get a PhD and write a bunch of books is really a long history of social activism and a set of questions that have sort of driven me that come out of social movement struggles, from the anti-war movement, from the alter globalization movement, from anti-racist education, and a whole variety of other sorts of struggles that I've been involved in through my short but exciting life. So I'm the author of a couple of 3 books, actually. One of them is called Crisis of Imagination, Crisis of Power. And it's a set of essays about the effect that capitalism has on the imagination. The second book, which I co-authored with my colleague and friend, Alex Kisnavich, is called The Radical Imagination. And it's about social movements and how social movements struggle against the forms of capitalism and racism and patriarchy that sort of haunt the world today. And the third book, which is more academic than the other 2, is called Cultures of Financialization. And it's about finance capital and the global movement of money, and specifically about how that affects our imaginations, how debt and credit and finance shape the way that we imagine the world.
And I think all 3 of those books all 3 of those books are like right in my wheelhouse, so to speak, as far as like what my interests are and doing this show. I'm definitely going to have you back on for the third book, especially. But I think for this conversation, the first 2 are just really, really big. It's a really, really big topic. And the purpose of me bringing you on was to basically have us be able to explain to people who are involved in activism, kind of like why philosophy is something important and something we should have as a basically something in our toolkit, so to speak, to help arm ourselves. Can you speak to why the radical imagination, first what it is and why it's important?
Sure. Well, the radical imagination, it gets defined in a number of different ways by different sorts of people. And maybe I'll start by kind of talking about the way that I think most people would typically imagine it. And that is that some people out there have a radical imagination. It's something that sort of exists in their head, and it allows them to think differently about the world. And often that term radical has a lot of negative connotations. We hear a lot about the radicalization of certain populations as if it's a bad thing. We think about the radical imagination slightly differently than that. When we're talking about radical, we're thinking about the original Latin meaning of the word radical, which is comes from the word for the root. And to understand things from a radical perspective, or to have a radical imagination, means to think about social problems and think about the things that are affecting your life and that are affecting society, not as just incidental or just happening here and now, but actually rooted in some sort of larger, deeper structure. So it means thinking about, for instance, the economic problems we're facing today as not simply the result of, this person or that person making a bad decision, but actually a deeply structural and systemic issue with the system of capitalism itself. And it would mean thinking about the forms of police violence that are being enacted today against Black people in the United States, for instance, or Indigenous people in my country of Canada, as not just the result of, you know, bad apples in the police force, but actually a deeply entrenched system of racial injustice that goes back centuries and needs to be addressed through really radical change. And again, radical here doesn't necessarily speak to the particular tactic someone's using. It speaks actually to a desire to transform society from the grassroots up and to really change the structures and systems of society. And then the second term in there is the imagination. And we usually think about the imagination just as like this thing that kind of like a television set in our brain that just is, you know, playing through things. And we all know we have an imagination, but we wanted to think about the imagination less as an individual possession and more as a collective process. And the way this works is that, you know, we don't just imagine, our imaginations don't just exist from the time we're born as this kind of natural and unchanging thing. What we can imagine is possible, who we imagine is valuable, what we imagine is valuable. These are shaped by our social circumstances, they're shaped by our experiences, and they are shaped by how we share ideas, how we share stories, how we share sort of notions of who and what is valuable with the people around us. So to put it all together, me and my colleague Alex Kasnavich, who we work together in this Radical Imagination project, we want to think about the radical imagination as something that social movements do together. And it's a really important part of the way that they function and the way that they operate. It's what keeps people together and keeps them with their eyes fixed on a horizon that they can sort of walk together towards. And without the radical imagination, you end up only ever responding and reacting to the actions of the powerful. The radical imagination is what allows us to say, actually, we are inherently valuable, our lives are valuable, and the agenda we set and the strategy we set is valuable. And it allows us to picture a different world and move towards it together.